Okay, thanks everyone for joining us for this, the second in our new online seminar series for IPSA RC14 Politics and Ethnicity. So I'm Lawrence Cooley. I'm one of the vice chairs of the research committee, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. So today we have two excellent speakers. We have Natália Calfat and Eduardo Aboultaif, who are going to both be speaking about different aspects of power sharing in Lebanon. So just for those of you who don't know Natália and Eduardo, Natália has a PhD from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, where she currently works as a researcher in the Laboratory of Asian Studies. She's also a teaching assistant at the IPSA USP Summer School in Concepts, Methods and Techniques in Political Science, Public Policy and International Relations. And indeed, she's an RC14 board member. Her research interests include confessional power sharing in Lebanon, veto power by minority players, Shiism, and decolonial approaches to both case studies and the study of conflict. Eduardo, our second speaker, is Assistant Professor of Politics at the Higher Institute of Political and Administrative Sciences at Holy Spirit University of Kazlik in Lebanon, which he joined in 2021. He's an expert in the field of politics of deeply divided societies, and he's published on a number of aspects of those societies, including institutional and constitutional provisions of power sharing dynamics, identity politics, civil-military relations, collective memory and trauma. And he's the author of two books, which you might know about, Power Sharing in Lebanon, which was published by Routledge in 2019, and more recently, Armed Forces in Deeply Divided Societies, Militaries and Power Sharing in Lebanon, Bosnia, Iraq, and Burundi, which came out with Brill just this year. Okay, so we're going to start with Natália. Each speaker is going to have about 15 to 20 minutes to present, and then we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for questions at the end for both speakers. So without further ado, over to you, Natália.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you all for being here. Let me start by trying to share my presentation. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, well, let me know. All right, so this is an effort trying to move a little bit on trying to differentiate a little bit from earlier works, or what I think is being done a lot by the literature on veto power in Lebanon, which is really trying to figure out how is it that compromise and agreement can be obtained in those deeply divided societies. So the logic is being a little bit inverted in this paper that I'm about to share with you, and would love to receive any comments and feedbacks, obviously. So there's a lot of discussion on, the misuse and abuse of veto power in deeply divided societies, Lebanon being one of them, and a lot of discussion on immobilism, polarization, fragmentation, and also how it has results in terms of the performance of such kinds of power sharing. I have also, in other works, discussed the informal types of veto that do take place in those scenarios, like frontal, non-frontal, and so on. But here my interest is a little bit on, I think, what's not being said is that, vetoes do secure state resources and key interests from those minorities. But I think veto, or the absence of veto, is also a strong instrument for securing state resources and for clientelist allocations by those same minorities and those same elites. And it also has interesting, I would say, results towards thinking about stability and moderation in those kinds of deeply divided scenarios and societies. So my research question in this paper that I wanted to present today is really under which conditions can cooperation and compromise be achieved, considering those scenarios that are very highly prone to stalemate and paralysis and deadlock and so on. And also what kind of implication does it have for stability, and also the type of clientelism and the type of maybe outside the formal ruling of power sharing in those societies. So the logic, as I mentioned, is a little bit inverted here. So instead of looking for how is it that the veto actually blocks a legislation, we're trying to understand how is it that, you know, interests can be guaranteed in spite of the absence of that veto. So those players actually choose not to enforce the veto. So I'm trying to understand under what circumstances that happens. And my major interests here are the infrastructural projects, considering the post-war reconstruction and development scenario. So here the biggest budget, as we will see, goes to the CDR. And my framework is, I have a method section a little bit later, but my framework is post-2005, when different minorities and new elites are incorporated into the executive design. So, you know, including increasing the potential for more deadlock and paralysis. And what are the types of implications that it has, not only for the formal type of consociationalism you have in Lebanon, but particularly for the informal. And spoiler alert a little bit here, how is it that these elites actually circumvent those formal and institutional constraints, and what are the types of innovations or plasticities that they create in this scenario, trying to, you know, really promote their own interests. So yeah, this is a case selection, the case-based study based on Lebanon post 2005, and I'm basically concerned with, as I mentioned, the CDR projects on infrastructure between 2005, when the governing elite has increased, and then until 2021. And here the logic is, you know, moving from the political ethnography of conflict, which would be studying veto, to political ethnography of collusion. So really going from conflict in a sense to compromise. And apart from the descriptive statistics on the type of legislation that's produced and approved by the CDR and the types of tenders, I'm also mapping the kind of political web and connections that enables the scenario to take place, the overlapping of political and economic elites. And I'm complementing that with a minimalist process tracing on the actual approval of such patronage legislation, with the support of 40 elite interviews of key political figures. So a little bit of the data, we do know that post-2005 instability increases. So you have a low global legislative production, but there's more into it that we would assume. So if we look into the nature of the decrees that are able to be approved, we will see that particularly those in orange and brown are the ones related to property and international treaties. So those, they actually increase. So there's a lot going on, even though you have many different veto players trying to, you know, enforce their rights. So we'll dig into that a little bit. Just to show you here how the CDR has the major budget allocation for those post-war reconstruction. So this is why I'm focusing on the CDR. It has 81% of the budget, considering the state agencies, and it has a key role in supporting not only the reconstruction itself, but also the type of clientelism that is able to be developed in Lebanon. So here I would say the relevance of the veto and the type of clientelism really have to do with how is it that the system, the power sharing system, is also mimicked, or is also mirrored outside that executive sphere. So you have the same type of power sharing elements, like veto, like general consensus, and or elite allocation of posts and so on, also in the CDR. So it's really a mirror, and it's really mimicking outside the state sphere the same power sharing logic. Little bit of the data on that. I think those Lebanon experts are quite aware that, you know, you have a lot of regional discrepancy, and it's not the amount allocated per region. It's not the amount that the region actually needs. And here I also wanted to show you the major projects are basically allocated to solid waste, to waterworks, and energy contracts, and so on. But I think going a little bit beyond of, you know, there is corruption in Lebanon. I think the innovation here would be somehow that I tried to first map this net of political and economic overlap that is maybe an enabling condition for the actual type of clientelism that takes place in Lebanon, and the kind of bypassing by those elites that are able to, you know, promote governance in Lebanon. And this is one of the elements that enables this is the overlapping of those concentric circles. So first, as most of you, I'm sure, are aware, it's the Zouama Seti. So the big six leaders here, from which I'm calling G6, that are the main sectarian leaders. But they're mirrored, and they're more direct or indirect linked to another circle, which is the middle circle of those middlemen and representatives in the CDR, in the executive board of the CDR, which I'm calling, you know, the G5 of the CDR, and then you have the G10 of the construction companies. So going a little bit beyond corruption, I think this is what enables those type of connections. It's what enables the power sharing rules or principles to be also mimicked here in the CDR. But the question remains, I mean, how is it that these people are able to agree over patronage and clientelistic propositions? And then for that, I think a causal approach and a mechanistic approach to really trying to understand how is it that those matters are approved is really necessary to understand that ethnography of the actual collusion. So I don't have time to go through all of that, but the idea here that I wanted to focus is how is it that one goes from, you know, proposing a clientelistic agenda for vote, and then actually the decree being approved in, of course, a patronized fashion, considering you have, especially after 2005, a lot of potentially vetoing players. So you have several instruments, both formal and informal, of veto that could hinder the process and could break out the process in the middle. And here I would call the attention for this, one of the key parts here is how the clauses are previously discussed outside formal environment of the cabinet. And how is it that these elites refrain from using veto because they foresee the capacity of being included in the allocation of resources, either immediately or in the mid to long term. So it's a cross-time temporal bargain that once they feel they are included in that particular time frame or in a further quid pro quo project to be approved, then they refrain from using the veto. So doing this mechanistic approach actually helped me trying to have that a little bit more clear and make sure these elites are able to agree and put forward the proposition and and make the legislation be approved. And here I'm focusing on the executive. Okay, so trying to sum up a little bit of the argument, some things it will be a little bit, I'll repeat some of the things I have already anticipated here. So the idea is that, as I mentioned, budget allocation for those major infrastructural projects post-war are very intertwined with regional clientelistic practice. And there's a lot of literature talking about that. And there's a lot of literature also talking about how is the incentives for immobilism and political instability are there, but not as much on the actual capacity of making sure cartel-like agendas are put forward and concluded. So looking to the CDR here really helps us trying to understand how these matters are approved and why they are approved, because it really replicates the consultational pillars. So it orbits around the executive, it mirrors the sectarian distribution of either resources or nominations and appointments, or the need for not vetoing to obtain consensus, or really those demand for everyone has to be on board for something to be approved. So it's really, the CDR is really a microcosm of the power sharing design itself, and it's also the political map, or the network, the net of political connections and the simsars, the intermediates, is also what enables this process to be approved, because it's really an enabling conditions to have informal government instruments and backstage and backroom negotiations, quid pro quos, and all of that really, once they set a priori and outside the institutional instances, that's how those propositions can be approved. And this also has discovered a lot of, which is really important, the kind of discretion and liberality that those political leaders do have, particularly in terms of the tenders and the procurements. So it's really about prior mutual consultations and informal bargaining channels and all of that, including all minoritarian actors, either the big ones or the really small ones. And here it goes as deep as, trying to interfere in the procurement process and rules itself, enabling particular companies to win or lose in the game. And I have anticipated that a little bit, which is the way that the agreement is obtained is through an anticipation and a calculation by those elites, which has to do with this intertemporal bargain, when they think in the horizon, or am I included or am I not included in the distribution and allocation of either contracts or a budget or so on. So here it would be sufficient for refraining from using veto if there is executive representation and inclusion in that scenario. So I think moving forward and trying to sum up a little bit the results and trying to think about perhaps reform as well. And with this, I finish. So I think I would say yes, veto is a form of making sure minority rights are considered in Lebanon and elsewhere. But also clientelism is a very important device, an instrument for tuning that political balance and making sure everyone is on board. However, it does have very paradoxical implications towards the type of democracy and the quality of democracy that's produced here. Because on the one hand, we talk about elite collusion and cartel-like agendas and so on, and this is pretty clear. On the other hand, we do have some sort of moderation and long-term stability being produced by this kind of anticipation and reasoning from the political elites that, you know, circumvent and bypass the very strict consociational and power-sharing rules established in Lebanon in a very informal way. So it's all the time, you know, theory and practice and formal and informal, and elites really bypassing and with much plasticity, I would say. So this is why it's very important to have this focus on consociationalism as practice, perhaps even more so at this point, given the literature knows so much about formal rules. So the core argument I would repeat here is really having representation and equity in the executive guarantees some kind of equitable control of those state resources actually guarantee some type of long-term order, moderation, and stability. Which in a sense, it's kind of paradoxical when we started discussing, you know, the very instability and so on that we do see in Lebanon and many of these places. So I think I would close with, you know, it's such a highly complex scenario, and it's such an interesting mixture of both formal and informal, and both working within the institution and outside the institution, or mirroring those para-state instruments, that consociationalism in Lebanon is very, very deeply rooted, not only in the state, but, you know, permeating the state. And I would say to finish here is that any type of reform would be at least very difficult to be implemented in the scenario, because you would not only have to think about, you know, formal rules, but also, you know, the type of informal rules that are taking place and how those elites are circumventing the rules, and they're very there's a lot of plasticity and turning around, and that's very difficult to measure as well, the impact. So I'm looking forward to receiving your comments and hearing your thoughts on this. Let me stop sharing my screen at this point. So just to thank you for your attention, and looking forward to your questions or comments.
Presentation and for sticking to the time so well as well. On to Eduardo.
All right, let me share my screen. 1 second. All right, so I will be talking about constitutional reforms in Lebanon, particularly to try to circumvent problems of immobilism caused by veto use or misuse. So the aim is actually to enhance power sharing regime in the country. Just a small background, basically, I consider the Lebanese political system prior to the Ta'if agreement, that is from independence until 1999, to be semi-consociational. I know that in the literature, many people, and if not everyone, actually considers it to be a full consociational system, but I detect the following points that actually makes this or renders the system semi-consociational. That is that the executive is concentrated in the presidential office, in which, according to the National Pact, the president has to be a Maronite Christian, And by concentration of executive office, I mean that executive powers, I mean that the president has the right to name and dismiss the prime minister and the government and ministers. In addition to that, the security apparatus in the country falls in the hand of the president, particularly the armed forces. So only the president somehow had the right to deploy or order the army to deploy in the country. And also much of the foreign affairs was restricted or exclusive realm for the president. Consequently, I felt that the system does not actually fall into what we know about constitutional politics. And also the government in the post-independence era used to function in a very weird way. So there was no quorum, no voting mechanism for government, and that is that the president, when he calls for a governmental meeting, the decision could be taken bilaterally between himself, the prime minister, including the minister in charge of a specific area. Things changed basically with the Ta'if Republic. Now, I'm working on adaptability, adoption, the adaptation, and the durability of the political system, in which I had the opportunity to talk to many of those people who were participants of the Ta'if negotiations in 1989. Thanks to a generous fund by the SNIS Network for International Studies, SNIS. So it's an ongoing project with Brandon University, Freiburg University, the Institute of Federal Studies, and Swiss Peace. When I talked to some of those people who were present in Ta'if, they said that the post-independent system was somehow presidential rather than a power-sharing system. So the Ta'if Republic then, it actually took these powers from the president, redistributed them to the government. So now we have a quorum of 2/3. We have decisions to be taken by a 2/3 majority if it is important decisions, and the constitution defines what are these important decisions. The security apparatus, particularly the armed forces, comes under the command of the government. So the government deploys the army now. So now you make sure that no single community is dominant over the other. No single community has this kind of power over the other. And in matter of fact, that makes the system a full consociation. Nevertheless, despite these enhancement of the system, I feel that there are still some issues in the way the system is functioning, particularly in the use of extensive veto. In the government or in the presidential elections and in the function of the government. So during the process of elections of the president, because electoral elections of the president in Lebanon takes place in parliament, and there is a quorum of 2/3 needed in order to elect a president. Now, I would understand that to be the case of a presidential office that is either semi-consociational or a full presidential system, because you need this kind of agreement or consensus among all players to agree to give this important office to a specific person or to a specific party. But today, because of the fact that the system has become a full consociation, I don't see the need to preserve the 2/3 quorum. Rather, it could be something like a 60% quorum or even an absolute majority quorum. Also, in the function of the government, in some cases, basically, there is an abuse of the quorum of 2/3. So even if the government wants to meet to take a very simple decision, smaller parties who could form the 1/3 bloc, they are capable of abusing the veto, and hence they actually demand that some of the things that they are pushing forward should be answered by the government, and in return they can go back to the governmental meetings and have the government function again normally. This is another problem that we are facing, and that means that we need also to be careful on how to use the 2/3 quorum. And probably if there are problems that the government needs to solve in the country are very simple. do not cause some sort of existential threat, culturally, politically, financially, linguistically, religiously, to any community, then basically you can function in a half plus one majority, that is absolute majority. The other problem relates to government formation, whereby the formation can take ages. So during the presidential era of Michel Sleiman, that it actually 1/3 of his presidential term was lost on governmental formation, 2 years out of 6 years, in a similar manner with that of President Aoun. And that is something, it's absurd. So the governmental formation process also needs to be somehow changed. In addition to these problems at the executive level, we have problems related to the supervisory committees. For instance, there is a lot of corruption in the country. There is the lack of accountability. There is actually the fact that the government sometimes takes over the role of the following institution: the Civil Service Bureau, which is responsible for admitting people to the public administration, issues related also to finance, and issues related to what Natália has mentioned in the previous lecture about the CDR, and then also about how the government actually distributes its funds. So there is a lack of accountability, or there are supervisory committees, but the government is overshadowing them. So for instance, when the government wants to employ people, or the state wants to employ people, the law says that the Civil Service Bureau has to take over the employment, and then it has to do that kind of procedures to allow for a promotion or even demotion. But then the government says, all right, we're going to take over that because the Civil Service Bureau can just propose names. And then we're going to put our names. And when we say that the government is putting their names, that is that it comes into the decision making, or the consensus, or sorry, the compromise between different political parties in the government. Despite the fact that actually the Civil Service Bureau is an important part of the bureaucracy. There is the State Consultative Council. It plays an important role in also, between brackets here, protecting the rights of individuals and communities vis-a-vis the state as a whole. But nevertheless, also, there is a lot of politicization of this role. Along with the fact that you have also the Accountability Bureau. So it looks at financial issues of the public sector. Where did the money go? All right. But then at the end of the day, it would say that Mr. X, Mrs. Y, etc., they have abused their power, and the money has gone somewhere else where it shouldn't have gone. But still, I mean, the Accountability Bureau can take administrative measures against those people, and it still has to send the file to the judiciary, and then the judiciary has to open an investigation, which brings me to the fourth problem, that is the politicized judiciary. So in Lebanon, the judiciary is semi-independent because it relies on appointments by the government. Appointments in the sense of, districts, in the sense appointments at the level of high-ranking officials in the judiciary. And consequently, we see that also there is a need for acquiescence from the government and also from the president in order to accept the judiciary appointments whenever there is a reshuffling. So under such circumstances, basically, we can see that the judiciary is either politicized, or sometimes it becomes not an independent branch of government. So what is the best way to grease the wheels, basically, and to reform the system? We have to preserve veto powers, but, apply some sort of fine-tuning, and to make sure to have less concentration of power in the executive. So in the recruitment and promotion, the law has to be revisited, and we need to make sure that recruitment and promotion at all levels, from high-level employees, the secretary generals of ministries, up to the lowest level, it has to be in the hands of the Civil Service Bureau. And of course, we need a law that provides an independent judiciary. That is, judges have to take care of themselves. They only have to report back to government in the sense of how much money do they need. And to make sure, to send a message to everyone or to clarify the point, the Lebanese judiciary does not really cost that much money, in the sense that I think within a couple of $1 million, the whole institution is functioning or has been functioning previously. So it's not really draining the Lebanese economy. There are important executive reforms. This is the second point that has to be introduced. So for instance, sometimes the process of governmental formation is halted because there is one person who insists on entering government. He is one person in parliament who represents his party. So we're talking about one MP. But he happens to be very close to, let's say, the 14th of March movement or Hezbollah or whatsoever. And then basically the process is halted. Now, that means that we need to introduce a threshold for participation in government by parliamentary blocs or by political parties. It could be 3%, 2%, 5%. That is something that I can explain later on, but particularly I believe it has to be restricted to political parties or pre-electoral alliances and not post-electoral ones. We also need to formalize the procedures of the naming of parliamentary or of prime ministers. So by constitution, the president has the right actually to take the 1 month, 1 week, 1 day, or even 6 months to call for the mandatory parliamentary consultations to name a prime minister. Also, we don't have any sort of procedure in which we have candidates, official candidates who are running for the presidential office. So that is that if you have 100,000 Maronites, the 100,000 Maronites themselves are actually candidates for this office. So we need that two parts has to be formalized. To what extent does the president has the right, to call for the mandatory parliamentary consultations, and who are those people who are to be nominated to be presidents? The presidential quorum that I mentioned before also needs to be reduced either to 60% or to absolute majority in parliament. There is a much need to empower the supervisory committees. Now, there is a lot of talk recently that it is actually power sharing and consociationalism that is leading to corruption. But in matter of fact, power sharing and consociationalism has nothing to do with corruption. The country will still be corrupted, even if it has a majoritarian system or a presidential system or whatsoever. Corruption is part of our day-to-day lives in Lebanon. Now, the problem is that you need to empower those supervisory committees, making them more independent and giving them a direct access to the judiciary. And then you allow also the judiciary to take its own actions by themselves. And finally, there is a need to create a Senate and a parliament free of confessional representation. So the Senate will be equally represented by all sectarian groups, and the parliament would be deconfessional. And in that way, basically, you create a balance between sectarian demands and also demands of regions, of secular groups, of socioeconomic pressure entities or pressure groups and what's. So long story short, basically, this is the presentation. Thanks again, Lawrence and Sheena, for your invitation. And thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing. All right.
Keeping to time and for a very clear presentation as well, with some ideas which hopefully will provoke some discussion and questions. So on that note, does anyone have any questions for or comments indeed for either of our speakers? If you do, please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask your question, or if anyone would prefer, you could type your questions into the chat and I will read them out. Okay, maybe while people think of questions and comments, I will get us started. So, question for Eduardo, given your kind of interest in kind of adoptability, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the kind of prospects of the kinds of reforms that you're proposing being adopted in practice. Would that be a kind of a difficult process, or one that you could foresee sort of a pathway towards? Yeah, so maybe Eduardo, if you want to start by answering that.
Yeah, well, in fact, basically, it is hard, particularly because constitutional systems are usually sticky, and also politicians somehow are reluctant to create a new system, even with power sharing arrangements, but a system that actually makes them have less power. So the whole idea of creating a government, let's say, or a branch of government that, and by the way, here, according to the Constitution, it is a procedural branch of government, what we call in Arabic, Sulta Ijra'iyya. It does not really talk about an executive branch of government. It's procedures. It's actually to implement full implementation of procedures as stated by the Constitution. Any sort of power that you're taking from government basically will be seen by elite as taking power from them. Of course, there will be a lot of resistance, but in the end of the day, if we take the last 12 years, we've had 4 years of the country functioning without government, and we've had also around three years and something of countries being run without presidents, without a president. So that means 5 years of state not functioning in the way that it should function. In addition to that, we are talking about a period where I think for 11 years we've had no public or no public law, no law on the budget or public budget. So you see, the problem here, hence, is about governability, which I believe that it is something to be blamed on the elite, and hence this is the argument that we need to take power from those elite and make it formalized in procedures on how to have the system functioning, particularly due to the fact that there is a lot of time frames where you have either no government or no president.
Thank you. Okay, so a question for Natália as well. So Eduardo made the comment that he thought that kind of corruption in Lebanon wasn't sort of reducible to consociational power sharing, but it would still be kind of present in presidential or more majoritarian systems. I wonder if you could just sort of reflect on that kind of observation a little bit. Kind of how do you see that kind of playing out in relation to the kind of specific research that you're doing on kind of infrastructure projects and construction?
Yeah, that also called my attention, and I was about to actually mention to Eduardo, I wanted to hear a little bit more from him this idea, because I think we are all clear on this is not a cultural characteristic of Lebanese. So, this Oriental approach of them being more corrupt, they're prone to corruption. And I'm very comfortable to say that because I'm Brazilian. So you could say we're prone to corruption ourselves. And also I'm from Lebanese background myself. So this would be a cultural approach that we can all agree it's not It's not feasible. It doesn't make sense, nor theoretically, neither in practice or whatever. The question remains. I mean, in general, the power sharing design and how the type of consociationalism implemented in Lebanon is to blame for the corruption, because it according to my research, I would say it's the way elites are able to agree for the most easily agreeable matters, those that do have the resource to be allocated, and that leads particularly to more corruption. But my question here would be, if we are to reform the consociationalism or the power sharing design itself, so you think the corruption it doesn't have to do with the power sharing itself? So if we're considering majoritarian approaches, corruption would be there. So if we reform the consociational system, I would say that would decrease, and that I think I would agree with Eduardo, that would decrease the room for corruption, because I think it's also a response to the institutional constraints, but also to the institutional incentives that it gives to elites because of the lack of monitoring organs and institutions and so on. So in that respect, I really think the root is institutional, and the solution should be institutional itself and within the power sharing dynamics, and not outside the power sharing dynamic. But it really has to do with the quality of the power sharing and the type of design and the type of engineering done within the power sharing itself. And here we can talk about formal, informal, or more corporate, more liberal, and then I'm sure you're all aware of that type of discussion in the literature. Don't know if that would answer your question, but I think it's thinking about that and trying to merge both works. That would be my approach.
Thank you. Eduardo, do you want to come back on any of that? There's sort of some questions for you there as well.
Yeah, let me give you an example about why I think that power sharing has nothing to do with corruption. So I bought a new car, and I need to register the car in my name. So there is the central agency here in which I have to take the car, to sign some documents, and then to pay for the registration fees, which by law in Lebanon, and then have the car registered and acknowledge that the state actually acknowledges my ownership of this car. Now, it's a simple process. It has nothing to do with power sharing, with politics or whatsoever, but for somehow, because it was closed for the last year and a half or whatsoever, because it is what we call the cave of Alibaba in Lebanon, where there is actually a lot of corruption there, in that institution particularly, I need to give money to someone, a middleman, who could bribe some of those people who work there and have my car being registered in my name. Now, this is a process. This is just an example of how it's not the political system. It's basically the bureaucracy or whatever you want to name it. This is how it functions. Now, whether the system is presidential, again, parliamentary, democratic, dictatorial, this characteristic, which is, I'm giving you one example of several, is going to stay unless, as I mentioned, we have the supervisory committees functioning independently, strongly, receiving the funds that they need, in which with an independent judiciary. That's when you could actually talk then whether you will be able to blame power sharing or not. But in the end of the day, power sharing does not really talk about, it does not actually deal with issues related to corruption. It deals with issues related with the vital interests of communities. and how you create that kind of institutions to protect that kind of balances. So, I mean, I'll give you another example. I mean, I have origins with Venezuela. Venezuela somehow was not associational power sharing regime, but it actually moved or backslided democratically from democratic system into an authoritarian one. But it had, and it's also pretty much corrupt. So it has nothing to do, I believe, I mean, with power sharing dynamics. So again, that's why I'm thinking about the supervisory committees and how they could actually put a tight hand on the bureaucracy and the public institutions, public agents.
Thank you, and thank you for the examples as well, personal examples, which help to kind of illustrate some of those dynamics quite nicely. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? Altin, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Well, I'm a bit new in the field, but I have a question for Natália. It caught my attention, if I got it right, that veto power in Lebanon has been used by sectarian elite to as a leverage to allocate resources to their affiliates. But this seems to have helped power sharing work in Lebanon. So it's kind of a contradiction. It creates corruption, but corruption also helps power sharing work and functioning. How do you find this relationship? Because it was very interesting for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's paradoxical myself. I would agree with you. It's an interesting result because and it's also a part of the duality of the work I'm dealing as well, because on the one hand I'm dealing with veto and the types of informal veto and how they paralyze the system and so on, and as Eduardo has mentioned very thoroughly. But on the other hand, trying to think about how come the system is so permanent and so enduring. And of course, we can also think about external elements that have helped the system endure the much it did. And I don't want to disregard that, but I had to, set a framework, and I wanted to understand the internal reasons for that. And one of the internal reasons I would say is that it actually has to do with the way those same elites continue in the country, and I think they reiterate themselves in different ways. So it's really political dynasties. It's political families that have sons and grandsons doing the same type of political management that their ancestors did, and it's really a long-term continuance, I think. So there's the international element that explains it, but there's also the internal endurance. But it's paradoxical, and I think that bothered me throughout the research, and instead of having to deal with it, I just realized this was a duality, and then we would have to deal with that as a duality, because the world is complex and it doesn't have to be resolved as so does it lead to immobilism or does it lead to stability? No, it's not a one way through. I think accepting the duality and that it's paradoxical, it was what I found to be what I had to accept. But I think it bothers a bit, but I think that's just the reality that is in place on the ground.
So just about enough time for one more question, if anyone wants one.
Yeah,
Last chance.
let me just say one thing, if you may, about accountability as well, that one important way of putting corruption under check is actually the electoral process. And unfortunately, in Lebanon, despite corruption, widespread corruption, despite failure by the elite, but still people are voting somehow for the same political parties, giving them legitimacy to rule on their behalf. So consequently, actually, people are also to be held responsible for these choices that they're making. It's a democratic system somehow. You have free and fair elections somehow. So they're electing again and again those parties that have caused the current crisis or the crises. So we need to keep that in our minds as well.
Okay, thank you both. So we're pretty much out of time now, so I think we'll leave it there. But thanks again to both of you for presenting your research. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. As I said at the start, this is the second of this online seminar series, and we hope to hold more in future. So do keep an eye on your emails. If you're not members of the IPSA RC14 mailing list, then I suggest signing up, and you'll receive notifications of future events. Okay, so hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.
Very much.